And we're back. Hey folks, welcome to History of Retirement again. And this is part 3. It's just a recap on the history that we're covering. In part 1 and 2, we hit the war pensions. And this is part 3. We'll discuss private pensions. And next part, we'll hit ERISA, and then we'll end with the current retirement trends and defined contribution. Remember these key issues that help understand retirement and understand ERISA. It's not so complex if we can understand the basic concepts. Why does it exist? How do you claim it? How do you enforce it? How do you pay for it? And who gets it? Purpose, administration, vesting, funding, and fairness. Time for a flashback. Let's recap war pensions. Remember the Roman land pension and cash pension. Talked about Pedro Ferdinandos, my ancestor, and his involvement in insurrection, ethnic cleansing, and tobacco barges. We discussed the Revolutionary War pensions. And my 5th great-grandfather, David Driscoll, an illiterate veteran of Monmouth and Stony Point. And we went through Greenberry Driscoll, my intrepid 4th great-grandfather, only remembered for being obese. We learned about the bonus army and the shameful attacks on World War I veterans. And we touched on the GI Bill and modern veterans benefits. So all of our key issues are implicated by these case studies. We can see purpose, administration, vesting. We've tagged all of these, funding and fairness, throughout. So now we can resume where we left off and hit 20th century pensions and the rise of private pensions. So remember that pensions were previously government arrangements, and that's because government had 3 things: the money to pay pensions, lots of people who wanted pensions, and demand to hire more people as their employees. So governments paid pensions to get workers to work for them or to reward politically popular people. But by the late 19th century, the economy is getting more complex. A more complex economy allows for larger and more complex companies, private institutions. As those private companies are getting larger, private pensions slowly follow. Companies are growing, that means they have that more money, they have more employees, and they have more demand for further employees. So it's a perfect recipe for pensions. So by 1910, there were, according to a later US Senate report, no more than 100 private pension plans. By the 1920s, we start getting tax exemptions. We've got the stock bonus tax exemption, profit sharing, and pension trust tax exemptions, clearing the way, making it easier for employers to start their own private pensions and get some leeway in the tax code. In the 1920s, we now have about 400 private plans. They cover, all told, 4 million workers. But of those 4 plans together are mega plans covering about a third of all of those workers. So 1.3 million workers were covered by U.S. Steel, Pennsylvania Railroad, New York Central Railroad, and AT&T pension plans. But all of the pensions together at this time cover about 15% of the wage and salary workers in the country. So getting to our key purpose of, or a key issue of purpose, what is really going on? Well, obviously recruitment. That's always a big issue with pensions, is just paying people so they'll do the work that you want them to do. But a new purpose at this time is retirement. This is a new concept, at least as we think of it. The idea was to get the less productive older workers to step aside and make room for younger, more productive workers. This is the beginning of how we look at retirement today. The idea is you're not dead, you're not too sick to work, but you're just going to stop working anyway. At the time, that was not how people saw it. There was a lot of resistance when they tried to introduce the idea of non-sick people edging their way from out of work to just being idle. That idleness was not native to the culture. People didn't understand that. The idea was you keep working till you're too sick to work or you're dead. And companies really wanted to encourage the older workers to make more room. So a secondary reason, aside from recruitment incentive, was just to make it easier for older workers to stop working. If they had enough money, they wouldn't have to keep working. So we're moving from a disability emphasis to more of just a healthy retirement emphasis that we would recognize today. Moving along with the history, if we get to the 1930s and the Depression, a lot of these early private pensions were wrecked by the Great Depression. Tons of bankruptcies of pension plans. A lot of workers were left with no benefit or significantly reduced benefit. And even though theoretically 1 in 10 workers had a pension, because of these limitations, only 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 of those workers would actually get benefits. A lot of that was due to vesting limitations or due to the bankruptcies. So if you have a promised benefit, but you can't make anybody pay, that is a question of vesting that really limits how valuable the benefit is if you can't enforce the promise to pay. And there was definitely a fairness issue at this time where a lot of plans were tilted in favor of managers, executives, the highly compensated employees. And in order to address this issue, the Congress took those tax qualifications that started in the 1920s and conditioned them on non-discrimination. So the plan could not unduly favor the highly compensated employees, which really drives towards fairness. So just tagging a few other famous items in history. So 1932, we discussed in the previous video the bonus army, their demands for early payment of their World War I bonds. That's going on at the same time in the background. And I don't want to get dragged into Social Security, but obviously that is happening at the same time. That act was passed in 1935, and there was a trust, and it would pay benefits. So it's very interesting. It's obviously directly on target with retirement. So it's very interesting, but it's, number one, such a huge, complex issue, and number two, very easily politicized that I don't want to get dragged into that. I think that we can find tons of history that implicates all of our key issues, so we don't need to get dragged into such an enormous topic. But I do want to flag that's happening right now in the background as we're discussing all of these other issues with private pensions. What is more important is the World War II wage freeze. So in the early 40s, there's very, very high income tax rates to pay for the war, and there's a wage freeze at the same time. But pension benefits and health benefits and welfare benefits are exempted from that freeze. This starts to have an effect on the economy that has carried through to the present day, which is a lot more compensation mix tilts towards pension, health and welfare, retirement benefits, non-cash things, something other than your salary and wages. And we still see that today in the tax code. That still exists to this day, and it really dates back to 1943 with that decision. So the World War II ends in 1945. Private pension plans start getting adopted at an even greater pace after that war ends. So we start to see more regulation of the private pension realm, and it starts to go very slowly at first. An important development was, instead of giving regulation of pension plans to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, which would have limited the scope to private company or public companies, publicly traded companies, and left out private companies, those that are not publicly traded on a stock market. Instead, the Welfare and Pension Plans Disclosure Act of 1959 is passed and gives the authority to the Department of Labor, which makes it, if not universal, at least generally applicable to most employers, including all of the companies that are not publicly traded on a stock market. As a result of that compromise, The DOL has it's such a broader mandate that they have a lot less power to actually enforce it. So whereas the SEC might have been able to really enforce these sort of pension regulations, if they had been given to them, it would have applied to a fewer employers, only the largest publicly traded employers. By making it broader, the DOL gets that authority, but that also means that it's almost toothless. There's very little they can actually do to enforce the rules until we're going to get to ERISA. But we are starting to see slowly more regulation of this space to try and bring it closer to what we would expect today on the regulatory side. The Studebaker Default. This is an interesting and really important inflection point in the history of private pensions. Post-World War II, we have a number of large automobile companies in the US, including Packard and Studebaker. And someone had the brilliant idea that we'll take two struggling automakers, Packard and Studebaker, and if they combine and merge into one gigantic struggling automaker, somehow all of their problems will be solved. And unfortunately, and rather obviously, this did not work. In 1958, the Packard pension defaults, and in 1963, the Studebaker pension defaults. Factories are shuttered, the company eventually fails. It is very painful for a lot of people over a period of years. The Studebaker default is especially important in the history of ERISA. It is often cited as one of the most important factors in ERISA, even though ERISA is more than a decade later. When Studebaker shutters their South Bend, Indiana plant, they default on the Studebaker pension. So at this time, Studebaker is the highest paying large automaker in the US, partly because they are not in Detroit, so they needed to pay people to come to South Bend. But they are giving generous compensation and very generous pensions. But at the same time, that pension is dangerously underfunded. When it defaults, they don't have enough money at all for everybody. So they decide that if you are 60 plus, you get full benefits. So that was about 3,600 workers at the time. If you are age 40 to 59 and you have 10 years of service, that's about 4,000 workers, you get a small lump sum, which is about 15% of the actuarial value of your benefit. Very small, especially unfair if you are closer to the end of that 40 to 59 range. It could leave you with very little time to make up for it. But if you were under age 40 or over age 40 but had under 10 years service, you got nothing. So that was another 2,900 workers who got zero. They couldn't even walk away with a 15% consolation prize. So it was very painful. Lots of people saw a lot of their benefits just wiped out. And aside from Packard, there had been other pension defaults around the same time. The United Auto Workers, the union that was responsible for these workers, they proposed several different times pension reinsurance to try and avoid instances like this. Now let's look at our key issues for the Studebaker default. With regard to vesting, obviously this is implicated. How do you even enforce the benefits? They did not have vested benefits until they retired. Early retirement was age 60 and 10 years of service. So if you couldn't get there, you didn't have a benefit. You could work there for decades and walk away with nothing at the end if you did not make it to 60 and 10. That's just really very difficult vesting. And just to preview ERISA, that's completely opposite to how it would work today. You could not work 30 years and get zero. And then funding is a different but very important issue. It's not the same as vesting here, of course, but they are connected very closely. How do you even pay for these benefits? It always matters who is paying. Studebaker itself never promised to fund the plan. This pension plan, which would be called the Studebaker pension plan, which everyone thought was the Studebaker pension plan, they got it for being Studebaker employees and building Studebakers at a Studebaker factory, and yet Studebaker is not obligated to follow through. The plan has the promise. The plan doesn't have enough money to pay most of these people, but the plan is the only one with the obligation to pay. And since nobody has to pay for the plan, that just leaves the employees or pensioners holding the bag. So funding goes directly into what's going to happen, who's paying for it, and if who's obligated to pay for it is not clearly spelled out in advance, then you can get situations like this where there just isn't enough money and nobody has to cover the shortfall. And the fairness is not quite so clear. Obviously, it's just unfair that it wasn't funded, and it's unfair that all of these people could work so many years and not be vested. But it's not clear exactly what you do once you're in that situation. The result they picked was that older and more senior workers were heavily favored, and you could get your full benefit. And if you were new and young, then you'd get nothing. But it's not clear how fair it is for the workers in the middle, especially those just under retirement age. What if you've got your 29 years in, but you're only age 59, you get 15%. That's pretty difficult. Or what if, let's say you're in your early 50s and you just started working for Studebaker 7 years ago, you get 0. So it would have been interesting if they could have somehow leveled it out. So maybe some of these closer workers who are a little bit older, they got a little bit more than 15%, or in some cases they got 0. There's no good answer. There just isn't enough money. There aren't enough chairs for everybody when the music stops, and it's just not clear. Any result is going to be unfair, but it definitely should make you think, what would be the fair result? Even if it's not clear what the answer is, what would be the fair result is useful to consider. And as I said, because of all of this difficult situation, all of these difficult questions, and because of the funding investing shortcomings, Studebaker is often cited for ERISA, even though it preceded it by over a decade. It is still considered perhaps the most important reason for why we have ERISA. Now, the second most common cited reason is Jimmy Hoffa. This is much less popular, but still you hear it a lot. Jimmy Hoffa was a mafioso. He ran the Teamsters Pension Fund. In 1964, he's found guilty of mail fraud, which are related to it's related to sending pension loans to mafia associates, mafiosi. At this time, it was actually very difficult to get Jimmy Hoffa because obviously it's before ERISA, but also there aren't actually federal crimes directly related to this issue, to pension malfeasance, to spending money with your friends or giving loans to criminal associates. It just nothing was directly on point. Eventually, they managed to trap him with mail fraud, but it was difficult, and a lot of ERISA was written to backstop that, to have certain protections like a fidelity bond, so that if there's any criminal corruption or embezzlement, that the bond would make the plan whole, or all sorts of, there are criminal statutes in ERISA, and that's supposed to protect people, but Jimmy Hoffa is often blamed for a lot of that, and so he's probably the second most common reason people say we have ERISA. Interesting little side note, hard not to talk about this without sounding conspiratorial, obviously. In 1971, his sentence is commuted, Jimmy Hoffa is freed, and there are all sorts of conspiracy theories about why Richard Nixon, who again, a Republican, commuted his sentence. But the Teamsters Pension Fund, which Jimmy Hoffa had been convicted of abusing, gives him a special lump sum of $1.7 million, which just seems like further malfeasance. But they did it. I think they did it. They managed to do it lawfully, but it was probably contributing to a sense in Congress that union-run pension funds were also lawless, and that might have contributed to why people who might otherwise be less inclined to regulate thought this is an area where unions are also being corrupt, and if we can get both companies and unions, then it's neither left nor right, it's not Democrat or Republican, it's not liberal or conservative. It's more of just an anti-corruption measure, so that post-commutation behavior might have also contributed to the perception in Congress that pension funds needed to be regulated, especially union pension funds. So we look at the purpose, why do benefits even exist? This brings us back to fiduciary standards, at least under modern pension plans. It also brings up, what is a criminal act? Can you just start spending the money? It's not specifically earmarked for anybody. Can you spend it on your friends? Can you dip into it yourself? What can you spend on? Do you have to treat that money as if you're at arm's length, or can you treat it like your own, like it's your own pocket? It's an important question that apparently hadn't been adequately answered at the time, so it was very difficult. And we have a lot of standards now that really establish what you can and can't do with ERISA pension trusts. And obviously that links right back into funding. How are you going to pay for benefits? Obviously, if Jimmy Hoffa is giving all of your pensions money to the mafia to, not even necessarily to pay for crimes, but just to look out for friends, unsavory characters, that doesn't leave any money left to pay actual benefits. To bring it back to our key issues, purpose, administration, vesting, funding, and fairness, really flagged them throughout as we were going, but purpose, we saw a couple new developments, right? So with war pensions, we saw two. We saw recruitment. We need more soldiers. We'll give you this disability or retirement pension if you come fight in wars for us. And we saw just the rank politics, right? We like these veterans. They served at the right time, so let's give to them now that it's gotten cheap. But we've now seen with private pensions a couple of new reasons. A couple of new purposes have come up. We saw the rise of retirement even though you're not dead or sick, right? The healthy retirement that you can just edge your way out. Companies might like it because they want younger, more productive workers. You might like it so that you can enjoy what we've come to call your golden years. And that is really new, and a lot of that has occurred at the same time as the development of these private pension plans. And then I think we also saw more of the fiduciary angle, especially with, to some extent, Studebaker, but mostly Jimmy Hoffa, where what is going on if you can just dip into the pension fund, if you can spend it on your friends? What is the purpose for why this money is being collected if you're just spending it on anything that you want? The purpose is to provide benefits. Fiduciary duties are to clarify that it's for the participants, it's not for the managers to just spend money on their friends. So those are a couple new developments that aren't really present in war pensions, at least not directly. Administration, we don't have a lot of developments over the war pensions, but it certainly was simpler because they had a smaller pool of people that were being dealt with. It was not a million soldiers where you had to get affidavits and stuff, but we didn't get as much change with the administration. We'll see more with that in ERISA and later. Vesting, we're clearly having some vesting problems, especially with Studebaker. ERISA is going to come in pretty directly on that point, and along with the fiduciary duties under purpose and under funding. The next key issue is funding. How are we actually going to pay for these benefits? If there's the Great Depression, will the plan just go bankrupt and nobody gets any money? If a struggling automaker just decides to shutter the plant, who has to pay for the plan? ERISA is again going to come in to try and address that issue. And fairness, we saw that the bias in favor of highly compensated employees has already been dealt with directly by the tax code as these private pensions have developed, but there are going to be other fairness issues that have and will continue to come up. So that all leads us next time on to ERISA, finally. Part 4 of these videos that explain why ERISA is not complicated, and I am finally going to get actually to ERISA. So thank you for your patience through this, and I hope to see you in the next part.